Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, will the gentleman from Sarangani yield the floor to a few questions?
It's my pleasure, Mr. President.
Mr. President, at the outset, let me congratulate Senator Pacquiao for once more bringing this issue on the floor. I have been present in a number of congresses in the past where this issue is hotly debated. And today, the gentleman from Sarangani, with his vast experience, now brings this again on the floor, and we thank, and the chamber owes him for giving us this opportunity to debate on this very sensitive issue. The first question, Mr. President, is, would the gentleman agree that death, when imposed, is irreversible?
Yes, Mr. President.
It is irreversible. And therefore, a death penalty, let me repeat that. Death penalty is a system worked out and imposed by judges and justices. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. President.
These are men, although of great knowledge. As human beings, they can be infallible. Fallible, I'm sorry. These judges and justices, in all their wise judgment, can be fallible, can commit mistakes.
Yes, maaari, Mr. President.
Maari pong magkamali sila. Hindi po ba?
Yes, Mr. President, but the most important thing is we have to trust our authority, which is the government.
No question. We trust our authorities. We trust Senator Pacquiao that it is in good faith that he is pushing for the death penalty. We trust our colleagues that they will decide in accordance with their conscience. But all of us are fallible. We can commit mistakes. Is that correct, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President?
It can happen, Mr. President.
It can happen, Mr. President.
There is no perfect in this world.
Correct. In fact, in the history of man, only one can claim infallibility. Would the gentleman know that man?
God, Mr. President.
Jesus Christ. And yet, Jesus Christ was a victim of wrongful execution. Is that correct, Mr. President?
Mr. President, it's hard to include what happened to our Lord Jesus Christ because it's purposely, Mr. President, it happened that way for the saving of lives of many, Mr. President.
I'm sorry?
For the saving of lives of many, Mr. President. Purposely, it happened that way, Mr. President.
Are you saying that the execution of Jesus Christ was a correct execution?
Perhaps what the gentleman means is that the redemption would not have been possible if Jesus did not die on the cross. This was a debate that we had with Senator Tolentino and I in 1993.
Because in the Bible says, Mr. President, Jesus said that he can command his angel to protect himself, but he didn't do that because purposely he's going there to sacrifice himself and for us to be saved.
That is the reason that
eternal life.
The saying that Vox Populi, Vox Dei is correct. Because the people wanted Barabbas to be released and not Jesus.
Yes.
Because God wanted Jesus to redeem.
And that is why we believe that Jesus Christ was wrongfully executed, Mr. President, because of the wrong Vox Populi, Vox Dei. Anyway, Mr. President.
Proceed.
Mr. President, going to the next issue, the gentleman has asserted that it is not a question, that the imposition of the death penalty is not a question of constitutionality. Is that a correct recollection, Mr. President, of the speech?
Can you repeat, Mr. President, the question?
The gentleman from Sarangani asserted that the reimposition of the death penalty is not a constitutional issue because, in fact, the Constitution allows it. Is that a correct recollection?
Yes, Mr. President.
And therefore, the debate should be on a question of policy. Is that correct?
No, Mr. President.
Why is it not correct to debate on policy? We are here in the halls of Congress precisely to debate on policy. As correctly pointed out by the gentleman, it is not a question of constitutionality. And I associate myself with that proposition because indeed the Constitution provides that the legislature, the Congress, may provide for a death penalty in heinous crimes. And therefore, there is no question that the imposition of a death penalty is constitutional. But is it a correct policy to impose the death penalty? That is an issue addressed to Congress. And therefore, the debate should be on questions of policy, not on constitutionality. Would the gentleman agree with that?
No, Mr. President.
So what? Oh, okay. So what will we debate on if not on
It's
policy?
already defined, Mr. President, the heinous and other compelling reason, Mr. President.
I'm sorry, I did not get the answer, Mr. President.
Other compelling reason.
Other compelling, other compelling reasons. In other words, are there enough, the question that will be raised is, are there enough compelling reasons to reimpose the death penalty? Is that what the gentleman suggests?
Mr. President, drugs is considered as a heinous, Mr. President, and that's why we're here to debate on that matter for if the drugs is heinous or not. But
yes, whether the drug is heinous or not.
that's why in the committee we have a discussion for on that matter, and we should be brought that in discussion on a committee level, Mr. President, the hearing.
Mr. President, when we craft a law, are we not establishing policy?
Yes, Mr. President, we establish policy based on the Constitution.
Well, the Constitution, Mr. President, allows the imposition of the death penalty if Congress so provides. And therefore, it is not an issue of constitutionality, but an issue of whether Congress, in its judgment, adopts the principle that imposition of the death penalty is the correct policy. Is that correct, Mr. President?
That's correct, Mr. President.
And therefore, we will be debating on policy, not on constitutionality.
Within the scope of the constitutional definition, Mr. President, we will make policy based on we are discussing here under the Constitution, based on the Constitution, and we make policy based on the Constitution, Mr. President.
That's correct. A policy cannot be contrary to the Constitution. The imposition of the death penalty is not contrary to the Constitution. But whether we impose the death penalty is a matter that the Constitution dictates will be left for Congress to determine. Isn't that correct, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President, that's why we're here to discuss it about
That's correct. We are here to discuss the policy of the imposition of a death penalty. Now, Mr. President, is the gentleman aware that the imposition of the capital punishment of death or capital punishment is automatically elevated to the Supreme Court for review?
Yes, Mr. President.
Now, the imposition of a death penalty is automatically subjected to review by the Supreme Court. Would this gentleman agree with that?
Yes, Mr. President.
Mr. President, would the gentleman know how many death penalties were imposed when the death penalty law was in effect? First, before that, would the gentleman spread into the record when the death penalty was effective in our jurisdiction after the 1987?
Mr. President, we can submit the complete data, Mr. President, but
Sorry?
we don't have right now.
Sorry?
We don't have data right now here.
You do not have the
We're
data.
going to submit the.
You do not have the data on the number of, I'm sorry. First, you are not aware when the death penalty was reimposed.
Ninth Congress,
Can you repeat the question, Mr. President?
when it was the gentleman from Iloilo is asking when the death penalty was reimposed. That is when the law was passed,
Yes,
and that was during the Ninth Congress.
yes. Would the gentleman know the month or the year that it was passed? And I'm asking this question because there are certain...
The Constitution, Mr. President, was passed on 1987 Constitution.
No, that
No,
was the
he's asking-
Constitution. Yes, the Constitution was passed was ratified in 1987. In fact, the Constitution prohibited the death penalty unless Congress provides otherwise. And
Unless for
Congress,
compelling reason involving heinous crimes, Mr.
that's
President.
correct. And the Constitution says so. So, just on for the record, when did Congress determine that it is an appropriate policy to reimpose the death penalty?
1993, Mr. President, Republic Act,
1993. That's
Republic
correct.
Act 7659.
Yes, that's correct. June of, I'm sorry, 1993, when the Congress enacted the law which imposed the death penalty. And subsequently, it was, the imposition of the death penalty was again suspended by an act of Congress. Would the gentleman spread into the record when that was? When that was suspended?
13th Congress.
2006, Mr. President, Republic Act 9346.
Was that?
The penalty was suspended.
Okay, yes. Now, would the gentleman know how many cases were reviewed by the Supreme Court where the death penalty was imposed?
Yun ang walang data.
Ito. Right now, Mr. President, we don't have the exact number or
Yeah.
count. We just gathering.
Yes, I would strongly suggest that when this bill comes up for debate, data of this nature should be readily available so that our colleagues can make a rational decision as to whether to adopt the policy of reimposing the death penalty. All right, but having said that,
As you requested, Mr. President.
yes, Mr. President, in the research of the gentleman from Sarangani of the death penalty, did he come across the case of People versus Efren Mateo E. Garcia, which dealt on the death penalty?
No, Mr. President.
No, you did not. You did not come across this case. And in this case, were you aware that the Supreme Court, in its decision, stated the number of cases that were elevated to them. Let me read to you the pertinent paragraph, since you did not come across this. But I would suggest you research on it, because we will raise this again when the bill is brought on the floor. Let me read to you, Mr. President, and spread it to the record, excerpts from the decision of the Supreme Court. I quote, according to the Supreme Court, statistics would disclose that within the 11-year period since the reimposition of the death penalty in 1993 until June of 2004, the trial courts imposed capital punishment in approximately 1,493, out of which 907 cases have been passed upon in review by the court. In the Supreme Court, where the staggering numbers find their way on automatic review, the penalty was affirmed in only 230 cases, comprising 25.36% of the total number. And let me skip the other sentences. The cases where the judgment of death has been modified or vacated consist of an astounding 71.77% of the total death penalty cases directly elevated before the court on automatic review. That translates to a total of 651 out of 907 appellants saved from lethal injection. So this, end of quote. In other words, Mr. President, if there was no appeal process, almost 72% of those convicted would have died for a wrongful death or wrongful sentence, because in almost 72% of the cases reviewed by the court during the period 1993 only until 2004, 71.77% of the death penalty imposed were vacated or reversed by the Supreme Court. That's a staggering number, Mr. President. May I have the comment of the gentleman on this staggering statistic?
That's why, Mr. President, we have automatic review of the Supreme Court.
We have an automatic review of the Supreme Court. And there was this automatic review post the saving from the death chamber hundreds of people who were wrongfully convicted in the first place. Would you agree with that?
Yes, Mr. President.
Now, is it possible that in the 230 cases where the death penalty was allowed, there could also have been some errors, since the Supreme Court justices are fallible also?
That's speculative, Mr. President.
That's speculative. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, Mr. President.
Now, it is speculative, but the speculation can include wrongful execution, since we are just speculating. Would you agree with that, Mr. President?
I think, Mr. President, that is your opinion.
No,
that is your view of.
We established earlier that through the responses of the gentleman, he agrees that man is fallible and can commit errors. No one is perfect. And I'm saying that even the Supreme Court justice, among us lawyers, we know that the Supreme Court can commit errors, except that they are the Supreme Court, and therefore the errors that they commit are supreme in nature.
I just want to read this line, Mr. President. When the death penalty upheld, it will be subject to an automatic review by the Supreme Court, subject to the concurrence of all justices.
Yes.
All justices, Mr. President, not only three.
So
Two
are you saying
all
that
justices.
all the 15 justices cannot commit an error?
That is part of the review, Mr. President.
We would request an answer.
I mean,
Is the gentleman
I
saying...
think what we need here is to give trust and confidence with their capability in our, especially to our judiciary, Mr. President.
We again put the question on the gentleman. Is he saying that the justices of the Supreme Court are infallible?
Mr. President, like I said, we all commit mistake, and it's not everyone's perfect, but
Yes.
we always we have trust and confidence with all the justices in the Supreme Court, Mr. President.
We can commit mistakes, as you said, Mr. President. As the gentleman said, we can commit mistakes. And if you commit a mistake and impose the death penalty, that becomes irrevocable. I think that's a clear conclusion that we can have, as the gentleman has agreed, that no one is perfect. And in this imperfect world, death can be imposed, and that imposition of the death penalty is irrevocable because you cannot bring back the life of the gentleman.
I think, Mr. President, the point here is...
Mr. President, in fact, any new evidence, okay, Mr. President, suppose, you know, in the criminology science today, there is a DNA test that is now feasible to determine identities. Now, where we have read of situations where the DNA test would show that the innocence of an accused. Would you agree with that, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President, speculative,
Yes.
Mr. President.
In fact, there were, I think we can cite a few examples where because of a DNA test, a judgment was reversed. Would you agree with that there are such,
Yes, Mr. President,
cases?
yes.
Huh? Mr. President?
It can happen, Mr. President.
It can happen, all right. Now, suppose after the death penalty is carried out, a DNA test would show the innocence of the accused meted the death penalty. Can the case be reopened and the judgment reversed?
Mr. President, the most important here is we have to trust our judiciary, especially ourselves. We have to trust ourselves. Kailangan magtiwala tayo sa sarili natin, especially sa ating
Tama po
gobyerno.
yan. Dapat magtiwala tayo, but even in evidence, even in law, in the practice of law, evidence such as DNA is given superior treatment because a DNA, for example, cannot be erroneous. On the other hand, a judgment of a human being can be erroneous, and the gentleman has agreed to that proposition earlier. It is for that reason that we are really, that we take a position that we are not agreeable to the imposition of the death penalty, because once death is carried out, it is irreversible. Even if we have new evidence discovered after the penalty is carried out, you cannot reverse anymore the execution. pag nagkamali ka nga, nilibing yung nagkamali ang huwes.
I think, Mr. President, yung mahuli ka.
Nilibing na yung nakasakdal. So it is that's the first reason why we believe that the death penalty should not be reimposed, because nobody is perfect, as the gentleman has agreed. So, okay. Is it, we go to the next topic. I have about...
Before you leave the topic,
Yes.
Your Honors, most of the propositions and the manifestation of the minority leader are correct, absolutely correct, for common crimes.
For
Common
common
crimes,
Oh.
but not for high-level drug trafficking. They can never be wrong. If it's a drug lord, you cannot be wrong.
Well-
And that is the proposal that I am proposing, not the common crimes. Forget about that. It's the high-level drug trafficking only. You will not have thousands being meted the death penalty. You will probably have in 1 year 1 or 2 maximum.
Only the drug laws,
Mr. President, with
Yes.
all due respect, our premise is the agreement of the sponsor that no one can claim infallibility, that no one can claim that they are perfect, no one can claim that all judgments are absolutely correct, so that where a judgment which imposed a death penalty is carried out, it becomes irreversible. That's all our point, Mr. President.
Yes, as
The
I said,
infallibility.
you're absolutely right. But I think my proposal will be on a different page.
Yes.
Anyway, please
Yes.
continue.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I think the most important thing here is we have to give trust 100% to the judiciary system, Mr. President. In that way, siguro mawawala yung mga, yung kumbaga, kailangan natin pagkatiwalaan ang ating gobyerno, ang ating sarili, especially sa gobyerno tayo. Pagkatiwalaan natin yung sarili natin, especially yung judiciary
Yes.
natin, yun ang importante kasi kung hindi tayo magtiwala sa gobyerno, especially sa judiciary natin, walang mangyayari sa bansa natin. That's
May
absolutely...
tiwala po tayo sa lahat. May tiwala po tayo sa justices. Ngunit ang problema natin ay ang ginawa ng tao, pwede rin may pagkakamali. Nobody is perfect, the gentleman has agreed. And therefore, we are working in an imperfect system which is imposing a perfect end to life or imperfect end to life. And if the death penalty is imposed and there is reason to believe or there is evidence that subsequently surfaces that indeed there was an error,
Mr.
the
President.
error is irreversible.
Mr. President, I respect your viewpoint of this discussion, Mr. President. But the thing is, Mr. President, even in the Bible, God given given authority, the authority to impose capital punishment. Permission, the authority to impose capital punishment.
Yes.
To discipline the wrongdoers, Mr. President.
And nagkamali nga doon sa penalty kay Hesus Kristo.
That's authorized, Mr. President, giving authority the government to impose capital punishment,
Yes.
which is
Even if it is wrongful, and I do not accept that, Mr. President, even if it is wrongful, the theory of the good gentleman is that the government is given that authority. We are here to debate as to whether that authority should be given precisely because of the pitfalls of that policy. Anyway, Mr. President, we will debate on that again when the bill is presented and sponsored, and I hope the gentleman will sponsor it again so that we can have a continuity in this debate.
yes, Mr. President. After the committee hearing, then we will discuss again here in the floor.
Unfortunately, I will be the one sponsoring it.
Sorry?
I will be the one sponsoring it and not Senator Pacquiao.
He's
bill.
volunteering, Mr.
bill.
President, to sponsor it. So,
No, it's my bill. My bill is for high-level drug trafficking only.
Okay, yes.
I think that is
Yes, Mr.
that will be the
President.
committee report.
we will debate on that when the time
Yes.
comes.
Thank you very much. But the majority leader, before the referral, may I be given a chance to seek the floor? Perhaps after Senator Hontiveros, she is asking for the floor. Then may I? Session suspended.